Magnus Carlsen is sitting on top of the world. He is the classical time control champion, the rapid time control champion, and the blitz time control champion. He is playing incredible chess. Our game today is from the FIDE Blitz Championship. Magnus Carlsen's opponent is Evgeny Tomashevsky. Magnus going into this game was rated 28-30, and Tomashevsky is 26-98, a battle of heavyweights. Let's begin. Magnus has white. He begins with e4, Tomaszewski e5. Very quickly, we get into a Spanish opening. White putting pressure on the knight in an attempt to weaken the e5 pawn. Knight f6, d3, avoiding the Berlin endgame, which would follow after castling. Knight takes e4, and after a few moves, you end up in this very complex endgame. But today, the trend has been towards this move, d3, and keeping things complex in the middle game, avoiding the exchange of queens. Bishop c5, now bishop takes knight, also a very modern idea. I mean, the idea is old, but it's being played a lot in modern chess. D takes c6, freeing up this bishop. And black has a free development and the two bishops. White has a stronger center and is applying as much pressure to e5 as they possibly can. Castles, knight to d7, helping to defend e5. c3, another strategy is knight b to d2 with the idea of going to c4 and doubling up on the e-pawn. But instead, c3 is played by Magnus. He wants to just push right through the middle of the board with d4. Castles and d4, bishop d6, now bishop to g5. Aiming at the queen and trying to get this move to be played, f6, which was played in the game. And after bishop to h4, we see this pawn on f6 is pinned. Basically, white wants to put as much pressure on this structure as possible, and they would like to exchange on e5 in a situation where black has to recapture with a pawn, and they get an isolated pawn on e5. c5, bishop to g3. Now, white's threat is to capture 3 times on e5, once with the pawn at d4, the knight and the bishop, and that would leave black with an isolated and weak pawn on e5. So in order to avoid that, he plays queen to e7 so that Tomaszewski can recapture on e5 with a piece and avoid the weak pawn. Rook to e1, and notice there's a vulnerability on this diagonal aiming at the black king. A queen b3 check is a possibility, so Tomaszewski gets off of that diagonal right now. And as it turns out, tactics could have helped Magnus quite a bit here. Computers show us that he can actually go ahead and take on e5 right now with de5, double exclamation point. The idea is after knight e5, black would need to retake with the pawn, and he has created a weak and isolated pawn on e5, and white still has the crippled queen side majority. That would be a real strategic advantage. The reason why that works is if black takes with the bishop, then the move f4 is crushing. After the bishop's retreat to d6, e5, and the bishop is completely trapped on d6, and white would win a piece. That's why de5 in this position actually would have worked quite well. Magnus plays knight to a3. The idea is to bring the knight to c4, and then put another piece aiming at e5. cd4, and now black takes the knight with the bishop, pawn takes. So black has given up his advantage of the two bishops. These B and C files, I mean, these are 3 healthy pawns, but they can be pretty easily targeted down in those open files, so it's pretty risky, let's say. Pawn takes d4, Magnus retakes with the queen, knight c5, aiming at the e4 pawn and liberating the bishop at c8, and now e5, advancing the pawn, trying to open up the rook against black's queen on e7, and here, if b6, let's say, then bishop to h4, and that pressure on f6 would basically force a weakening. At some point, pawn takes, and the f6 pawn would be weak. So knight to e6 is the response from Tomaszewski, obviously counterattacking the queen, but he doesn't have to move the queen. Magnus can go ahead and take on f6 because the pawn threatens the queen. And in this position, if knight takes d4, then fe7 hits the rook at f8, and if you take on f3, rook to e8, then rook a to d1. And you can just see with these rooks, white is completely dominating this endgame, and white would just win in this position. So instead, Tomaszewski takes with the queen on f6, but then queen to c4. The idea is Magnus wants to move his other rook and just completely centralize everything with a lead in development and everything centralized to put as much pressure on black as possible. c6, Rook A to D1, just look at those rooks. Just beautiful pressure down the middle of the board. Knight to G5, seeking to trade pieces. White does trade. And now a very strong move here. Really strong. Magnus plays the move H4, and it seems sort of inconsequential. I mean, he's giving his king a little luft here. But the truth is, by hitting the queen with this pawn, the queen basically has nowhere to go that white can't hit it with a tempo and gain a move. So queen to F6 was played in the game. So now rook to D6 attacks the queen and allows white to move his pieces into very aggressive places. Obviously, the bishop on G3 defends that rook. That's why he's able to do that. Queen moves to F5, rook to E7. And here the threat is for white's queen to either go to D4 or C3, and the pressure on G7 would be unbearable if a white is able to do that. Magnus is just building advantage one upon the other. B5 was played by Tomashevsky. It doesn't really matter so much at this point, I don't think. Queen to D4. Obviously, Magnus is just threatening queen takes G7 mate. Simple as that. So black plays queen to G4, defends the pawn at G7, but also because the bishop is defended by the bishop at C8, excuse me, the queen, defended by the bishop at C8, he's offering an exchange of queens. But instead, white plays bishop to E5, continuing to pile on to G7. Queen takes D4, bishop takes D4, and in this position, the game ended. Tomaszewski resigned and Magnus won. And it may look like it's not quite ready to resign, but it is. The game is over. In fact, there's actually a long forced mate here if you put it into a computer. Let's take a look at one possible line for black. Rook to G8 seems obvious, right, to defend the pawn at G7, but then just rook takes G7, and you can't recapture the rook because rook to D8 is checkmate. The rook at G7 is pinned by the bishop, so he's not able to do that. If bishop to E6, then you have these simple discoveries. Rook to G5 check, you just block a couple of times, and mate. So after that position, Magnus Carlsen won and was on his way to becoming the World Blitz champion again. By the way, if you enjoyed this game, be sure to hit the subscribe button and join us for future videos. See you again soon. Bye.